Impacts of World War II in Europe, Part 7. I promise you, we are almost done. No, not really, I'm lying. This one looks at the impacts in the Soviet Union and Britain, and no learning outcomes because you got this. In looking at the impacts of World War II in the Soviet Union, we can see that the Soviet Union was really, really heavily devastated by World War II. So she lost more than 25 million people and a third of her military. So the number of people who died, largely civilians, amounts to about 15% of the total population. And this is going to have massive repercussions for development of the country moving forward, because a lot of that loss was actually in the economic productive range. So the young, healthy people who helped to produce and support the economy. And so this loss was about 40% of the European total. And of course, we know that one of the reasons why this loss was so heavy was because, in many ways, Stalin fought a zero-sum war. And for the HL topic, we'll spend a little bit of time looking at the Great War from the perspective of the Soviet Union. And so this is known as the Great Patriotic War, not World War II, but the Great Patriotic War in the Soviet Union, because this was not about stopping tyranny. This was not about liberating the rest of Europe. This was really about protecting the motherland. And so this was fought as a like on the home front as patriotism to get everybody to throw everything they could at the war. And so since so much of it was fought on Soviet lands, you have a massive destruction of factories, of cities, and infrastructure. And so both sides use scorched earth tactics. Essentially, destroy everything that is there so that the other side can't use it. And the Soviets did this as well. And ultimately, it worked in that Germany was strung very far from their supply lines and couldn't maintain this war, but it meant that there was a huge amount of destruction within Soviet lands that Stalin is going to have to attempt to redress. From the things that we discussed previously in terms of the political impacts, the Soviet Union benefited from the redrawing of the borders with the treaties. And part of that is because they had been such an important ally during the war, and because they lost so much that essentially they were being repaid. And so as the Red Army pushed the Nazis out of Russia, they just pushed eastward. And so pretty much everything that the Soviets liberated, they kept. And remember, in part of the phony war, the occupation of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, that again is going to continue until essentially 1990. And so here, just as throughout the rest of Europe, here's an image of Stalingrad. Again, the same issues of unemployment, destruction, lack of housing, so on and so forth. And so the Soviet Union, though, is going to receive reparations from all of the Axis powers. So this is, it's going to be billions and billions, and it probably adds up to like trillions of dollars in reparations. And that is all, and you know, going to be used to rebuild the country. And so Stalin was an aggressive negotiator. Ultimately, because of these reparations, because of the stuff that the Soviet Union is getting from East Germany, in terms of the dismantling of the factories, because of the lands that she continues to occupy and the resources that they have. The Soviet Union actually ends up World War II in a better economic position than the Western European powers. They were tapped out, and like the Western Europe was tapped out, the Allied Western Europe was tapped out. Their treasuries were empty. The Axis powers, their treasuries were empty, but still had to give up money and goods and intellectual property to the Soviet Union. And so, they were, but so the Soviet Union was actually in a better position. And this gives them political influence, especially in Western Europe, and the occupation of, political influence in Eastern Europe, and the occupation of those Eastern European countries essentially gives the Soviet Union this opportunity to become a much larger player on the world stage than she had been previously. And this is the Soviet Union now as a superpower. And this allows her to set up satellite states in Eastern Europe. And these satellite states act as buffer, political buffer, as well as a source of resources for the Soviet Union. So Stalin receives a massive boost in support amongst the population. And part of this is propaganda, of course, right? Because Stalin is the guy who led them to victory. Stalin is the guy who stood up against the tyranny. Stalin is the guy who got them all of this really great stuff that's going to help the country. And so there's this increased sense of nationalism. And then, of course, at this time, and I say of course because, well, it's Stalin, there is going to be a purge of the Red Army again. And partly because this is going to be, people who won, people in the army who helped lead to victory, who had important roles during the war. They are now gathering support amongst the military, amongst people within the party, etc. And so Stalin needs to purge the army of these potential threats to his rule. And now that World War II is over, they're not really needed all that much. The Soviet Union now has diplomatic recognition internationally, something that the Soviet Union didn't have prior to World War II. She has a permanent seat on the Security Council of the United Nations. She automatically is a member of the United Nations, and now diplomatic negotiations and these treaties involve the Soviet Union. But despite this UN membership, she is isolated economically, as you have the Soviet Union turns down the Marshall Plan, and of course, by the time you get to the late 40s, essentially this Iron Curtain has descended, and there's very little trade happening between Eastern Europe and Western. Britain was left with huge debts to the U.S. and the Commonwealth states. One of the things to remember is going into World War II, in terms of the Great Depression, the UK hadn't been doing very well at all. So she had been devastated. Parts of the country had been hugely devastated by the Great Depression, some places having up to 70% unemployment. And so she didn't really have any money to build up the military, to purchase arms, to mobilize. And so that was funded with loans from the U.S. in terms of supplies and food and so on and so forth. But also states like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, they all funded this war as well as sending people to fight. And so Britain had a lot of debts to handle, and this means that she loses her ability to be a world and colonial power. As we stated previously, people are going to need stuff focused, resources focused at home, and so there's going to be a drawback from maintaining the colonies. And one of the things also to remember is that Britain was the world's largest colonial power, with colonies spread everywhere in the world, and that requires a very well-funded and expensive navy, as well as the maintenance of armed forces in all of those various areas. And she is going to be no longer able to do this. So, along with the U.S., Britain received reparations in intellectual property, and this is going to help moving forward. The people voted out the conservative wartime government and then implemented or voted in the Labour Party. And so people were very grateful to Churchill that he led them through and brought them to World War II, but people were also really sick and tired of fighting and stuff. And so instead of a conservative government that was rooted in essentially 19th century ideas as to how the government should be run, what was the relationship between the government and the people, they decided to go for the Labour Party instead, which was a lot more socialist leaning. And as continuing massive infrastructural damage, shortage of basic needs like food, shelter, coal to heat homes, rationing that happened during wartime continues through the post-war period. People are not happy. And then, of course, there is the need to reabsorb millions of people in the former military now that a large wartime army is no longer needed, and Air Force. And so demobilization results in strikes and mutiny because people don't have homes, they don't have money, they don't have a way of supporting themselves. And so this is part of the instability that the World War II brought to Europe. So strikes and mutiny by soldiers, which is really dangerous because these are people who have guns.